This is kind of interesting to see Fauci sort of say, well, wait a minute. No, it could have come from the wet market, because he really kind of needs it or wants it to come from the wet market for a lot of different reasons. But China's coming out saying, no, we don't think this is where it came from. Where are they thinking that it came from? Are they saying, do we know?
You know, later in that interview, Fauci went on to say, if you criticize me, you're criticizing the science, right? Science itself, because I represent science. And it's just so funny because Fauci, what he actually represents is an extremely arrogant and highly politicized elite that has been couching its own interests as absolute truth, as science, in order to avoid scrutiny and debate, which is exactly what Fauci did in this interview. You know, and it really just goes to show you how there's so much on the right now that is sort of opposed to whatever comes out of Fauci's mouth. And we look at them with all of this disdain, but whose fault is that, right? Like, whose fault is it when people start to be suspicious of the science when the person who is supposed to represent it is so deeply politicized in this way?
And Dr. Fauci actually responded to that criticism in this same interview. Let's take a listen.
Anybody who's looking at this carefully realizes that there's a distinct anti-science flavor to this. So if they get up and criticize science, nobody's going to know what they're talking about. But if they get up and really aim their bullets at Tony Fauci, well, people could recognize there's a person there, so it's easy to criticize. But they're really criticizing science, because I represent science. That's dangerous. To me, that's more dangerous than the slings and the arrows that get thrown at me.
Oh, the arrogance of this man. Senator Rand Paul hit Fauci back on Twitter, saying the absolute hubris of someone claiming they represent science. It's astounding and alarming that a public health bureaucrat would even think to claim such a thing, especially one who has worked so hard to ignore the science of natural immunity. And, you know, I wonder if Fauci, obviously he's not elected. He's not accountable to a democratic process. He's a bureaucrat and a career bureaucrat. He's been in the bureaucracy of the government for like 1 trillion years. And do you think that that distance he has, that lack of accountability to the people, is the reason he has this kind of imperious, lofty sort of self-regard when he gets criticized?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, talk about dangerous. Like, what is more dangerous than a party apparatchik taking on the mantle of science itself? So the wonderful satire site, the Babylon Bee, had a headline back in October, so it was quite prescient. You know, the headline was, Fauci says attacking puppy torture is an attack on science.
I've always kind of wondered what is it about this that bothers me. And I think what it is that, and I'll deal with problems. And I think what it is that the public invests a certain amount of trust in journalists and a certain amount of power in journalists. But that is power that they're supposed to be using for the public's benefit. Like, you know, in the United States, the First Amendment and the reverence that we have for the press, even as it isn't exactly reflected in polls lately, you know, has given reporters and journalists a measure of credibility. But they're supposed to be deploying it for the public's benefit. And so when they use it for their own personal gain, I feel like it's a betrayal of that public trust. And I think Cuomo was doing that kind of times 1,000 here. Like, the reason that he had access to this information, it's not because he's a particularly wonderful person. It's because he was a primetime host at a cable news outlet. You're supposed to use that power for the public's benefit, not for your own personal benefit. And I think in that betrayal is the place where he's going to have a hard time recovering from.
Yeah, I was listening to some commentary, and there's definitely a large number of people who basically take the line that, you know, family comes first. I would do whatever I needed to do to help protect my brother. At the end of the day, wouldn't you do the same? And I think what that analysis misses is that, one, I mean, you can do it, but you're going to have to suffer the consequences, and that's what's happening now. But more importantly, that the information that Chris Cuomo had did not come by him randomly. It came because of the position of access he was in as a journalist. And to me, the analogy is more akin to, you know, if a police officer or somebody else invested with the public trust were colluding with a defendant or a public official or what have you, against the interest of the public, as you say, Ryan. And I think that given the enormity of the scandals that happened over the course of the last year, both the COVID nursing home scandal and this Me Too scandal, and given that CNN itself pushed the relationship between the brothers as a selling point, putting them on air together and giving them giant props. At one point, there was a giant Q-tip prop that the brothers were using, and the joke was that, oh my gosh, you got a big nose and here's a big Q-tip because we got to take COVID tests because people are dying. Like, I don't even know what the gag is. That CNN was really trying to play off of the closeness of that relationship also makes this whole dynamic very unsavory.
But I think this is exactly why I think this is why Chris Cuomo is actually going to be back. I don't think that this suspension is going to last for too long. And I think it's because people are actually very forgiving of him on this particular issue. And even I can feel sympathy for the guy, right? I say, oh, well, you know, if you put yourself in his position and it's your family member, and, you know, I think a lot of people could say, I probably would run cover for my family. And again, of course, he's now suffering the consequences of that. But I think because it's a relatable sin that people are all willing to say, you know, I maybe would have done the exact same thing. I think that is why the public will be very forgiving of him on this.
So here's that exact quote, so everyone has it, from Justice Sotomayor. She asked, quote, will this institution survive the stench that this creates in the public perception that the Constitution and its reading are just political acts? Which, I mean, I think I agree with Emily's point that, I mean, and also in a weird way, like the Supreme Court took this issue under the initial Roe v. Wade decision, took this issue out of the hands of democratically elected forces. And for all this, you know, rah-rah democracy, everything has to be decided on a democratic basis. The right is eroding democracy, et cetera. Well, this was an example where progressives or liberals, people who are pro-choice, wanted to take this issue out of the hands of local democratic authorities. How would you respond to that, Alaimi?
Well, I'd say whether or not you don't like this decision or you think it was arbitrary in terms of the actual language used in it in 1973, it has been the law for almost 50 years. It's been the law and people mostly support it. So what we always have to remember is that making abortion illegal does not stop abortion from happening. What will stop are safe abortions, equal access to abortions. People will be exposed to that danger, to these back alley abortions. And we have to remember that that's the world that we lived in prior to Roe. These decisions don't happen in a vacuum. They happen because women were taking these risks to have these abortions. Women were dying, and that's not hyperbole. You know, we ban abortions, people do die. So I look to the fact that this has been reality, not how we would have felt about it 50 years ago, but the fact that there are people currently existing relying on it.
Let me just say, I agree with that. I think that's absolutely true. If we ban abortions, women will die. It's going to happen. If that happens, we will see back alleys. We will see the return of that. There's no question. But you know, from my perspective as somebody who's anti-abortion, who's pro-life, the balance, the sort of cost benefit there is still firmly in the favor of overturning Roe.